elaboration on our mission vision for the summer. Now I ask you to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Please find it in your device or in your hard copy Bible. Verse 11 to 20 is what I will read for as the text today. Okay, this is Moses giving his farewell sermon or sermons. There are 3 sermons recorded in this book. This is the middle sermon. This is the long sermon. And Moses is giving this sermon to the people of Israel right as they are getting ready to cross the river Jordan into the land of Canaan. Moses will not go with them. God said, no, you don't go. But in order to tell them again and again and again what this all means, he's preaching this message. Okay? Verse 11. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you, and to do you good in the end. Beware, lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Now, Moses is reminding the people of Israel what it is that God promised them as they're about to seize that which God promised. And that is the promised land, the land of Canaan. Something about the land of Canaan, as it's described in the former chapters and verses, that it is a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a place of flourishing. Of course, there are many other conditions that makes it so wonderful for the people of God, but it is definitely not like the wilderness where there is absolutely nothing to sustain your life. But when you go into the land of Canaan, the land will have its beautiful, wonderful provisions ready for you. You go and you will enjoy so much of the material good that you would be very, very satisfied in your heart. This is what you're going to get. This is where you're going. God is determined to chase away 7 nations before you. That's what we in chapter 7. He names every 7 tribes of Canaan. And God said, I will chase away all those nations. They are, from human standards, they are more numerous than you are. They are stronger than you are. But I will chase them out before you. And I will give the land to you. You shall have it. And of course, this also has multiple meaning. It's the time for God to bring what is a intervention of the final judgment in history, because their sin has climbed up to the top. God waited for that time, and Israelites were used as an instrument of God's judgment on them. But from the Israelite standpoint, from the standpoint of the people of Israel, it's God giving them a huge favor. Oh, amazing grace, that they may go in to the land that looks impossible to conquer, yet God will make it absolutely possible for them, and they will do it. This is what's promised before them. So, how would they respond to this situation? Okay, so the people of Israel suffer for 40 years in the desert, and finally they are entering into the land of Canaan, and they find out that yes, it is the land flowing with milk and honey. It's a flourishing land. It's a place where they will multiply as people group. Their enemies will be subdued. And how would you respond to that situation? Well, there are two possibilities. And the first possibility is a great possibility. It's a good one, right? It's what you have in chapter 8, verse 7, all the way to verse 10, but I'll just read verse 10. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. So that's first option. That you go in and you get everything that you thought that you were getting and more, right? So God gives you abundance of earthly riches and flourishing. And what do you do with that? You bless God. You thank God. You offer God worship. God, you're so good to us. We want to honor you. We want to bless you. We want to worship you. We want to give all the credit to you. So that's first option. It's great. That's how everybody should respond. Every good, blessed man and woman of God, every good believer, every Christian should respond this way when you are brought into this kind of earthly blessing. But then there is the second option, second possibility. And that's what we have in the passage that we read, verse 12 and the following. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied. See how that word multiplied repeats over and over? That's just plentiful. Then what happened? Verse 14. Then your heart be lifted up. It means what? That you will be filled with pride in your heart. That you will raise yourself up as if you have become a god. And you shall be filled with pride, and you forget the Lord your God. That's the other distinct possibility. Wow. Okay, what do you think? All right, maybe you are living in this kind of flourishing time yourself. Maybe you're making more money than you ever did in the past. All the relationships are great. Your parents are healthy. Everything seems to be going your way. There's a lot of promise to your career, present, and the future. Where are you? How are you responding to this situation? Are you blessing God and giving Him thanks for all that He has given you as grace to you? Or have you become prideful and have you forgotten God? Moses is really worried that when they enter into the promised land, a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey, as they multiply way beyond what they are as of now, their hearts will become prideful and they will not bless God, they will not thank God, they will not even remember God. They will forget. Forgetfulness will settle in, and they, out of their pride, will say, I did it because I work hard. This is what I get. You know, as I pastored a church for a number of years, as I meet very different people in different situations, I am beginning to see a pattern that people come to me often, or people call me often when there are hardships in their lives. Their loved one is sick. Some kind of diagnosis just happened, and it seems like a very serious situation. Someone is dying. Someone lost a job, and there's a brokenness of relationship, and all kinds of situations that would be somewhat of a trial and difficulty, matter of suffering. People turn to pastors when they suffer, which I think is a good thing. I think that's the great privilege of a pastor, that I get to meet people in the most vulnerable times. You don't go to anybody in vulnerable times. You have pastors, and that's wonderful. But on the other hand, I rarely get contacted for people's success. When you get the job of your dream, when you make a big money for your bonus, when you have some wonderful new relationships that you are really thriving in, I rarely get to hear about it firsthand. I might hear it through others. Maybe you don't call me when you get that big bonus because I'm going to tell you to give it as an offering or something like that. I don't know what the reason is, but generally speaking, people don't seek out a pastor when there are good things going on in their lives. Usually when bad things going on in their lives. The question is why? It's because when things are going well, when your life is multiplying, when you are filled with milk and honey flowing in your own household, when all of these things happen, you don't have a sense of urgency. You don't have any sense of problem. When things are hard, when things are going rough, that's when you seek God. You cling unto God. You pray. You cry unto Him. But when things are going well, it doesn't seem special at all. There's nothing special about this. This is how things should go anyway. And you just take it as is. But it's interesting that Moses calls that a pride. It's a pride. The pride is that when things go well, I don't need God. When things aren't going the way I want it to go, it's probably because I'm managing it well. It's probably because I'm working hard at it. It's probably because I'm making some good decisions. And it's not because of God, it's because of me. But only when things don't go well, only when things don't go the way you want, that's when you seek God, because that's when you think you need God. But Moses says that's the definition of pride. You have established yourself in place of God, especially in good times, forgetting that it is not your hands that brought about these things, but it's because God provided you. God strengthened you. The pride comes from this, and the word that strikes us in this passage is the word forget. Lest you forget, lest you fail to remember. The pride in this case, and I think it makes a lot of sense to me, pride is equal to what? Forgetfulness. You are prideful. Why? Because you are forgetful. Forgetful of what? Forgetful of these things. I'm going to talk about two things from the passage. And basically what Moses is saying in this sermon, which I am preaching to you now, is that don't forget. As a result, don't be prideful. Don't forget these things. Number one, don't forget what? Don't forget your experience in the wilderness. Don't forget the wilderness in your life. Chapter 8, verse 2, and you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. 40 years of wilderness. What is a wilderness? Are you right now in a wilderness? Or are you in the land flowing with milk and honey? Wilderness is very unique with these characters. Think about it. First of all, in wilderness, you cannot create your own food. You cannot work on the land like a good farmer would. You cannot sow the seeds and wait for it to grow. You cannot do anything to make your own or produce your own food out of the place where you are at, you see? It's impossible to do it because it's a wilderness. That's the definition. In a wilderness, you don't have a house. In a wilderness, you don't have a city. In a wilderness, you are basically camping out every night. So you are exposed to bad weather. Deserts gets cold at night. It gets scorching hot in the daytime. And there are all these wind storms. There are sandstorms that can invade you. All kinds of trials and pestilence. Disasters can fall upon you. You have no defense. You're basically camping out in a wilderness. You have no defense from your enemies. If there are people that are trying to get you, there's no way you could defend yourself. There's no natural mountain to protect you. There's no river to divide you from the enemy. It's an open land. If they come and invade your territory or whatever that you have as your camping ground, you cannot stop them. So, wilderness is where you're constantly at war. You're always battling. You may have something on your right hand that you need to have in order to make your living. On your left hand, you got to have a weapon. You cannot let go of the weapon because every one of you got to fight. It could happen anytime. When Bible describes the Israelites, they are called the 600,000 soldiers. That's a lot of them, right? But it's a lot because these soldiers are not picked out. Who are they? It's every man from a certain age as a teenager all the way up to as old they are, yet able to bear arms, right? I could be a man in his 50s, and for example, in the case of Caleb, he was an old man, yet he was still a man of war. He was still able to fight. He would be a soldier, right? So it's every man falling into a particular age group. So many of them because they were all fighting wars together. That's what desert gives you. You cannot have a specialized army and the rest of them civilians because you're constantly open to exposed to danger of those who invade you. Wilderness is where you don't have ownership of the land. You're always a guest. You're always a sojourner. You're always wandering from place to place. And when you need to pass through a neighboring ground of some other tribe, you have to make sure that they're not offended. None of it is your land. So wilderness is a place where you cannot create a good life. You cannot have a good civilization or culture in wilderness when you are constantly threatened. If you don't have a city, if you don't have a steady environment, if you don't have a still water, if you don't have protection from harms, unless you have the streets made up and the houses built up, unless you have places set up to raise cattle, you cannot have a culture or civilization. Unless you have land to cultivate into farming land, you don't really have any kind of cultivation or culture. There's no culture in wilderness. You are basically surviving. That's the definition of wilderness. Wilderness is a place where there's no way you could live alone. Wilderness is a place where you cannot survive by yourself. It's a place that you need help every time. You need support. You cannot do it alone. There's no way you can ever say, I did it. Wow, how is it possible that in the wilderness for 40 years, Israelites survive, more than survive? It's not like their number dwindled from 600,000 to 100,000 or something like that. No. If you look at the book of Numbers, it begins with that number, it ends with that number. After 40 years, there was a sustained number of people that survived. There's a sustainability that was provided. Why? How? How is it even possible? And Moses says, looking back the 40 years, this is what it means. This is what wilderness means. Verse 2, chapter 8, wilderness is a place where God humbles you. That He might humble you and test you to know what is inside your heart. You see, wilderness is a place where your heart is exposed. The question is this: who do you really trust? Who really is important? What is important in your heart? It exposes your heart. It makes your heart naked before God and even before yourself. In that very moment when you are not able to do anything on your own, when you are totally humbled, what's going on in your heart? But not only humbling, but what we have in verse 3, and He humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, that He might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So what God is doing in the wilderness is that He's humbling you, and He's even making you feel like you're at the borderline of hunger. Manna is like that. You never feel like, I ate so much. I have so much in the storage that I don't have to worry about tomorrow. Manna is always just enough. It's a daily bread. You cannot keep it for next day. Next day, it's next day. And what you are experiencing in the wilderness is a lifestyle. And what kind of lifestyle is that? It's a lifestyle of faith. I have to trust God. There's no other way. I have to trust God. There's no other way. And Moses reminds them, but during the 40 years of wilderness, what happened? You ate manna, a heavenly bread from God. He provided you with manna every morning. On Sabbath, He even calculated everything so that on Sabbath you would not have to gather. The day before Sabbath, you would gather for 2 days. But the day after Sabbath, you cannot gather for 2 days. It's not allowed. It will not happen. The food will go bad if you keep it overnight. But God was meticulous. Your clothing did not wear out. Your feet didn't swell. Moses says, God led you as a father would lead a child. Everything that He did was like a father to a son. He kept you in His discipline. And we read in the passage today that He led you through this large, huge wilderness that's filled with danger of serpents and scorpions. And out of a hard rock, He made water gush out. You drank in the dry land. Especially manna. There's an emphasis on manna in chapter 8 that's spoken about twice. Remember manna. Remember manna. It's a daily bread for 40 years. Once again, it's a daily trust of God's provisions. You cannot trust yourself for provision next day. You only trust God for the provision next day. Why? Because there's nothing visible until the day comes and the manna is there on the ground. After a while, you get used to it. Maybe you even get spoiled and think that if you don't get it, it's strange. But God did that for 40 years. You got it every day. Every day. Trusting God every day. Trusting tomorrow into God's hands. Living every day with God. Remember the temptation that Jesus underwent? He was driven out into the wilderness. It's strange that God would drive Him out into wilderness. He's led by the Holy Spirit into wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And it certainly resembles what happened to the Israelites as they were led by the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. representing the very presence of the Holy Spirit with them. And Jesus was led out into the wilderness after he was baptized in River Jordan, just in the same way as Israelites came out of the Red Sea in baptism with Moses. They were driven out into wilderness. Jesus was met by the devil. And the devil tempted him. This was a humbling experience. And the devil said, hey, you've been hungry. You have not eaten for 40 days, 40 nights. What happens to you when you don't eat for 40 days and 40 nights? I don't know. I've never tried it. I don't plan to try it in my lifetime. I know there's some hardcore pastors in the previous generation, I guess, who said, I fasted for 40 days, and somehow they had this huge spiritual experience. And I tend to think it's hallucination. But anyway, after 40 days of fasting, what happened? What happened? I don't know. But I could imagine, like you literally are at the end of your life, physically speaking. If you're still surviving, that's almost a miracle. You're hanging on to your life by whatever that remains in your body. And it's very easy, I think, that every stone that lies on the ground of this wilderness looked like to Jesus a piece of bread. And the devil's basically telling him, hey, you're special. You're son of God. You are not a son of God. You're the son of God. Well, in fact, I'm not sure if you are that. I think that's you. Why don't you make whatever provision you need? Get it. Eat of it. Drink it. Do it. You can do it. You want to do it. Do it. We face this all the time, right? There's that temptation, the temptation that says, do it. You can do it. I mean, why would you sin if you can't sin? You sin because you can. You want it. There's a craving in the heart. But Jesus knew. What did he know? Well, he knew what this wilderness meant. Wilderness is a special time. Wilderness is a time when there is nothing but God. It's a moment when you trust nothing else but God. There's nothing in you that can trust in wilderness because all your resources bottom out. You are absolutely standing one-on-one with God. If you don't have God, you have nothing. If you have God, you have everything. That experience, that wilderness experience, the wilderness experience where you experience your utter emptiness and you experience the utter fullness of God, that wilderness. And Jesus said, quoting this passage, chapter 8, verse 3, as Jesus said to him, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. What does that mean? Does it mean that, hey, here's the word of God, I guess I rip out a page each time and just eat it? No, of course not. You know what it means? The word of God here means the promise of God. You live by God's promise. You live by God's presence. You live by God's grace. That's wilderness. That's the time when you know the meaning of the covenant relationship you have with God, which God vouchsafed by His own life, with His own blood in His Son, Jesus Christ. The covenant relationship, the promised relationship between you and God, that's the only thing that remains. Nothing else. You're absolutely bottomed out. But it's the time when you really test what's in your heart. There's nothing but God. Have you ever had that kind of moment in your life? And I think that's a trial of believers living in time of plenty, when the expectation is so plenty, expectation is so automatically, generated, where you should have all these things, where there's no such thing as desperation, there's no such thing as going to bed hungry. When everything is there, that hunger, not only physical food, but in every way. Do you ever have wilderness experience in your life? But sometimes it does happen. It happens when you lose things that you trusted so much, yet that reveals in your heart what it is that you are trusting. When you lose that job you thought was permanently going to be there for you, in the most critical time, that job goes away. And what happens? Well, you can't pay for your fancy car anymore. You cannot pay the rent for your fancy apartment. When the mortgage is backing up, when you are embarrassed by the gazing of the people, when you are in that moment, when you are just hearing what doctor's saying to you, here's the situation, and it's not going to be easily fixed. When your pride is no longer sustainable by the things you have. No longer the standard of this world will give you a sense of comfort. At that very bottom out experience, wilderness. To be very honest, I don't remember when I had this. It's been so long, I feel like. I had something slightly like that recently, but it's nothing unnatural. I have prayer requests, yes, in my heart, but I still manage it somehow. But those desperate moments, I stand here before you, not in a desert, in a wilderness. I stand here before you with flourishing. Many, many of you looking at me with twinkling eyes, listening to my sermon. I don't feel lonely. I standing here and preaching is always a little nervous, but I'm good because you love me, don't you? You're not a bunch of critical minds looking at me, ready to criticize me. I don't feel lonely. I don't feel alone. I feel multiplied. But what happens when I'm alone? What happens when there's nothing to sustain me? What happens when there's absolutely nothing? Is there something you can remember in your life as wilderness? Moses says to the Israelites, you were there for 40 years. Remember. Don't forget. Spiritually speaking, you know what this moment is? It's the moment when you came to realize your utter helplessness in sin and misery. That moment, I don't know when, whether at a retreat or just overnight prayer, I don't know, at a worship, one of those days when you are hit by the realization you cannot save yourself. You're a sinner to the core. When you know that you don't have the resource to be the person you want to be. When you are utterly broken. And at that moment when the cross of Jesus Christ shines before you as the only hope, but it's a radiant hope. It's a blessed hope. I'd rather have Jesus than anything else. Christ crucified is my one and only hope. That's wilderness. Have you been there? I think one of the problems of our life is that we think that every problem is such a life-threatening issue because we've never been to the wilderness. We never know how to stand one-on-one with God. We're surrounded by people with goodwill. We're surrounded with things that we can enjoy. Worship is taken away because your heart is already drawn to what happens after. So many promises of entertainment. Sometimes our greatest sorrow is having our favorite sports team lose out. Because we've never been to the wilderness. I hope you have been. And if God is leading you at any moment to that moment when your heart is tested, when you are humbled, I pray God will give you wisdom to see that as your moment of blessing. Don't forget your wilderness. Second, this is it. Don't forget Yahweh God. It's repeated. Forgetting God, forgetting God, forgetting God. That's the problem. Don't forget. But what does it mean to forget God and not to remember God? What does it mean to not forget Him? It's not some kind of remembrance. It's not like remembering somebody that you should respect and honor. It's not just remembering your parents or remembering your grandparents or remembering some historical figure. These great men who have gone before you. My frequent walk on Valley Forge Park these days, I always walk to that monument. I circle it triumphantly, and I walk back to where I live, which is really wonderful. It's a great 1.5 hour walk. And all these names of generals, people who gave their all for the future generation like us. But when it says, remember God, it's much more than that. It's not a remembrance of great people in life. You know what it means to remember God? Remember God means to remember who He is. Remember that God is God. Remember that He's one and only. Remember that He is the Lord. Forgetting God is equal to pride. Why? Because forgetting God means you become God. Oh, what do you mean? I don't become God. I can't. I dare not become God. But you know what? Becoming God means this. Verse 17, beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. I did it. Me. It's me who did it. Now you're living each day by your own strength and you have become self-sufficient. When there's nobody higher than you, when there's no other person who is going to help you, you are God. You are it. You are the highest. You are the top. You have deified yourself. You made yourself absolutely sufficient. And you begin to either worship you or sometimes get disappointed because you expect better. Just as sometimes we get disappointed with God because God should do better. It's weird. Our lives are a constant cross-section of what? Self-deification on one hand, like making ourselves God, and doubting ourselves, self-doubt, self-deification, going together, jostling. I thought about my own life as I came to this, because I don't want this to be some kind of theoretical message. I want it to be a message that really sink into my life, and I realized, do I ever deify myself? Do I ever say out of pride, I don't need God? Well, I don't think I say it. I don't think I ever say, God, I don't need you. But I must say that I've gotten so used to this pattern of life where I manage things okay. I manage things well. I become a manager of my life. I'm a CEO of my life. And I do it okay. I do it. So I manage as much as I can. I perform as well as I can. I try to be good to people as much as I can. And I don't need God to do it. I do it because that's what I think I should do it. And then at the end of the day, when I feel like I haven't done a good enough job, I just say I'm disappointed in me. Sometimes I am very disappointed in me. Sometimes I am despairing. Is that all I can do? But you know what's funny? That despairing, that disappointment has nothing to do with God. It's all about me, looking at me, either to say, good job, or on the other hand, you could have done better than that. Self-doubt, but there's also this, and what's going on in all this is that there's no God. It's just my natural processing. But that's pride. It's forgetting something that's very important. That is, every day, every moment, you do what you do what you can because of God. Here's a real irony of sin. The irony of sin is that you are doing something because you can. You're sinning because you are able to. But when you think about the fact that you are able to because God gives you that enabling to do. It's a great irony. We sin, what? How do we sin? Well, we offend God by taking advantage of His grace. We take what God gives to us and we turn it back to Him with shame and dishonor. That's what Adam and Eve did. They saw the fruit of the tree and they were able to look at it. Oh, it looks good. It's good to look at. It seems delicious. They're making all kinds of mental analysis. It seems like it's going to make me wise. A decision. Function of their cognitive faculty. Who gave it to them? God did. But they're using it to dishonor and disobey God. They reach out, grab the fruit. They are able to chew it, taste it, and swallow it. But where did he get that motor skill? Where did he get that ability to eat and consume? God made them. Only a chapter ahead, God created them and breathed it into their nostril, a breath of life, then they became the living being. You see, here's a great irony. When you sin, you're not doing something on your own. You're sinning, you're taking advantage of what God has given you and twisting it in such a way that you are bringing shame and dishonor to the one who gave it to you. See, that's the real problem. As one of the professors at the seminary said, old Professor Bentil, he said, a sinner is like somebody who's in the bosom of a loving father. And the father carries the son, loving child, beloved child, and the child is firmly, securely held in the father's arms. And the son looks at the father's face, and out of his ignorance, he swings his fist and hit him in the face. That's what sin is. You are held by God, yet to Him, you strike Him with a fist of hatred. That's what happens when you don't remember God. When God is not God, and you think everything belongs to you, but every single thing that you have is given by God. Remember. So I'm going to close with this. Are you in a desert right now? Are you in a wilderness experience? Cling on to God. Do you feel like you've been having a good life and you've never had any sense of crisis and God seems so theoretical and distant? Maybe you should pray today and say, God, make me stand on the top of a cliff, not just to endanger myself, but to have that sense of urgency. The truth is, like that rich, foolish man, God could easily say, tonight I'll take your soul away from you. What will happen to all this plenty abundance that you have? We are living at the edge of the cliff. Life is like that. We don't know seconds ahead of us. But God is gracious to sustain us. Everything is by grace. Faith perceives that. And we cling on to Jesus, who is the author and the perfecter of faith. Don't despair. God is with you. Don't be prideful. It's all because of Him. Trust Him. Let's pray.